Achtung, welcome to We Have Ways of Making You Talk with me, Al Murray, and James Holland, the Second World War podcast, for any new listener who is unaware of what exactly we get up to on this podcast. Where we
or
talk
if you're on the other side of the herring pond, then it's World War II.
World War II. The 1939 to 1945.
Well, no, 1941 to 1945. I apologise, I got ahead of myself there.
The world at war.
The world at war.
How are you, Jim? You're back, because last time we spoke, you were in Freiburg looking at the German...
I was in the Vaterland, and I'm now... I'm
in
now
the
back.
Militärische Archiv, weren't you?
Yes, behind enemy lines, etc., etc.
Lovely.
But yes, now back safely. I've got back across the channel.
Great.
Landed on a secret strip just in my Lysander.
What, Heathrow?
No, Gatwick, actually.
Oh, right. Oh, well, they're definitely the airport second choice. Yeah,
to be definitely to be avoided.
And was it good hunting? Did you find what you're looking for?
Yeah, it was pretty good hunting, actually. It was pretty good. And actually, it ended with me going to the Tagesbuch Archive in Emmendingen, which is literally only about 10 miles down the road from Freiburg. Yep. Yep. And the Tagebuch Archive is obviously the National Diary Archive. And I came across this extraordinary chap who wrote vociferous numbers of letters. I mean, just extraordinary numbers, but also kept a diary. And there's this little kind of shoebox of diaries going all the way back from just before the start of the war right through to kind of 1947. And you know the type. They're kind of small. They've got tiny little pages. They're only about 3 inches high by, inch and a half wide. Tiny thin paper, all written in beautiful kind of sort of ink pen.
Yeah.
And I opened the one for 1944. First page, there's a 4-leaf clover, very carefully kind of taped in.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. It obviously worked because he made it.
Right, yeah.
But I'll tell you what else was really touching about it, was there was another notebook there, and it was clear that he was a company commander in one of the Gebirgsjäger divisions, one of the mountain divisions.
Yeah.
So I guess he was at 5th, probably, the 5th Mountain Division. So he would have been in the 51st Mountain Corps.
Yeah,
and L1, and he obviously took a lot of, he was obviously one of those people that was slightly more humane and took care of his men and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah,
and he had a little notebook so that when his comrades were killed, he had all their up to date information so that he would use as
to write to their families.
Right to their families.
Wow,
really amazing. It was really quite something to see.
That's a good officer, then, isn't it? That's what that is. Yeah,
I think it was, and he was a little bit older, and he was married, and had kids, and all the rest of it. And you can, I don't know, it was touching. It was a reminder, if any was needed, that it's all about the humans involved. It's all about individuals, and they might have been on the wrong side, but they're clearly not all they're not all Nazi bastards, and they're not all bad, and
Yeah, and have you got enough now to have you cast it yet? Are you fully cast, or are you still?
Well, I've started the casting process now, and I'm going through the kind of sort of rafts of thousands of photographs that I've taken over the last 2.5 weeks, and they all need to be organised, put back into, because you might photograph a whole file, and that might be 120 photographs. So you need to get those 120 photographs, put them into a file, join them all up, put them into a PDF, reduce the file size, make the whole thing manageable.
Yeah, and
that's all. That'll take me a week to get all that done, to be perfectly honest. But yeah, that's good. But I've had a very nice weekend because I've been reading. I was lucky enough to read your book in an early gestation.
Yes,
and now I've been reading it in its final gestation, and I've got to say I have been unbelievably impressed. I think it's incredibly good, Al.
Thanks, Jim.
And I know everyone who listens to this is going to go, well, of course he's going to say that. He's his mate, and he's on the podcast with him. I mean, what else can he say? And I know there's that old adage, show, don't tell.
Yeah.
But to a certain extent, folks, you're just going to have to trust me on this. It is unbelievably good. And I found even your introduction, which I hadn't read before, very arresting. And I thought, and it was an interesting point, because basically what you're saying is, if I got this right, is that it's all operational level, it's all statistics, and it's all kind of 45% on spent by the on the German economy, on the Luftwaffe, and all the rest, which shows that the emphasis is more west than east, a la Phillips, Pace and O'Brien and all the rest of it. And industrialization and numbers. But it's still got a massive human dimension. And I found that really resonated. And I think, with all these arguments, these new kind of academic ways of looking at things, and I think Phil takes it, I think his work has been invaluable and really, really interesting. But you can take that too far, because you can't dehumanize something which is fundamentally a human experience. And I think that's what you're bringing. That's your thesis in this book. And I think you were right. You point out that this is not about naval commanders. It's not about airmen. This is about land commanders, because ultimately you can say how much you like about naval importance and you can say how much you like about air importance, but ultimately it's still boots on the ground what takes land. And you're not going to win in the end. You've still got to get up that mountain, cross that river, take that city, get that bit of desert, whatever it is.
Well, as the Allies discovered that you can flatten cities all you like, but in the end you have to go to Berlin. You have to go to the capital to bring this thing to an end, actually. And that if what you want to do is rewrite things politically completely, which is what they've decided they have to do. My favourite, well, it's not so much the quote, but it's who it's said to, right? So it's Stalin, at the celebration meeting, the Moscow Soviet of Working People's Deputies and Moscow Party of Public Organizations, right, says, this is a war of engines. It's impossible to have too many of them. The side having the largest number of engines is bound to win. And he says that in November of 1941, right, when he's really up to his neck in it. But he's still he's able to say that. He says that confidently, and he's right to an extent. But hardware is one thing. It's the people, the software is the way I sort of see it, because after all, you're asking people to spend their lives on this, and no matter how much stuff you've got, and there are obviously various moments in the war where the Allies have considerable material advantage and still can't quite get it to work. Yeah, and that's because it's people. It's people, and the people leading them, because the reason I've got Francis Tuker for 1942 is because 1942 is the Janus-faced year of the Second World War, where you're looking back at defeat and forward to victory. Like almost smack in the middle of the year. Yeah, and you're literally.
It literally is the middle of the year, because it's kind of May, June is the kind of the
when
nadir,
things
isn't
have gone so badly and then start to knit themselves together. Yeah, and of course that coincides with when the decent kit arrives. But you've also got to be able to use the kit. You've got to figure that out too. And you can have all the material advantages the Allies have, particularly in intelligence, which is after all one of the stories we like to tell ourselves, reassure ourselves that our intelligence effort was better than the German intelligence effort, particularly the British sort of business end of Enigma and all that. But it's a much, much more complex picture than that. And also you can, as in Crete, you can know the enemy's intentions, but if you haven't figured out what actually to do about them, prioritized properly your defenses, properly got for instance, a radio net that works, that means you don't have all sorts of harebrained commands that get diluted the further down the chain they go. None of it.
Well, or if you're simply not a good enough commander to be able to deal with the information that's coming through.
Yeah.
Then, ignorance would be bliss, wouldn't it? I mean, you're better off without it.
Exactly. And I think it's because this is really what, and this is also why I end up on Peter White at the end of the book, because I'm trying to say, because there's a lot of people in the book. It's going across their desk, and yes, they go and see their battalion commanders sometimes, and yes, they go and do their sort of front. We talked about this last week with Mark Clark. Whether it's PR or whether it's leadership, you tell me the difference in the 1940s. I don't know that I necessarily see one, but they're necessarily bundled together. But actually, when you're Peter White and you don't know who's on your left flank, who's on your right flank, what that hill even is, whether it's the last hill you're going to have to take in this series of attacks, or whether it's just another one and you're going to have to do another one tomorrow, whether this start line's the last start line before you're, and so on.
Well, yeah, I've got to say, and I think the Peter White chapter is among my favourites in the book. And actually, there's a bit here where he's just he's going out, and there's a sort of irony of that he's in the King's Own Scottish Borderers. They're part of the 52 Lowland Division. They're the Lowland Division, but they've been trained in mountain fighting.
Yeah,
they're kind of they're in reserve, but when they do get brought over, they're not doing any mountains. They're doing lowland stuff, which, as their name suggests, is appropriate, but actually, as their training suggests, is completely inappropriate.
Yeah,
and they're like Johnny-come-latelys, and yet, boy, do they kind of make up for that in the ensuing months. And there's this great bit where you say his training would be excellent. He thought battle school had done what it could to get him used to the idea of combat, and he had been subjected to exhaustion beyond all his previous experience. But in the end, he didn't know if he was ready. The biggest unknown factor was the mental reaction of the individual, especially of those in responsibility. What part would fear play? How well could it be overcome or hidden? The tense realization dawned ever larger that the lives of one's friends and one's own life would depend on split-second decisions in an unknown world of utter chaos. And I think what's really, really interesting about this whole chapter is it underlines, if ever you needed underlining, that literally the worst job you could have in the entire Second World War, pretty much, in the Allied armies at any rate, probably any army, frankly, is a platoon or company commander.
I think being a platoon commander in the infantry is the, and I'm sure other arms within the army would say, actually, because there's that terrible incident where all those sappers are killed because their anti-tank mines all go up, and they go up in a great long daisy chain up the line that they're bringing up. Now that's quite clearly a terrible job too. But I think being a platoon commander in the infantry is the shortest straw of all. And that really comes across. And it's a brilliant way to end the book, because it's a reminder that you can have your Pattons and you can have your Monties and you can have these guys at the top of the chain. But actually, yes, again, this is about people, but it's also about people at the bottom of the line too, making decisions and making those split-second decisions which you're talking about. And crikey, I mean, of all the studying I've done of it, of all the people I've spoken to, of all the kind of memoirs, diaries I've read, it's heart-stopping every single time. Yeah. Because you just think, and obviously my mind is now on Italy at the moment, and southern Italy, and that kind of grim winter and autumn into winter into spring, of scrabbling through these mountains with their mule trains and having to make kind of terrible decisions, and the casualness of the violence and the brutality of it, and the utter difference of experience that most of these people in Peter White's position would be discovering. So one minute you're having quite a half-decent life, half decent upbringing, half decent house, loving parents, family, all the rest of it, bed to sleep in, creature comforts. The next minute you're transported into this just awfulness. Yeah. And of course, weather does make it worse. And I did get that note about, as James Holland goes on ad nauseum, by the way. You made a footnote, Jim. You got yourself into a footnote. The thing is,
I feel quite flattered, but it is, we can't imagine it because we haven't done it, but you can get a taste of it. You can get an understanding of it. I think you can. We've all been in the cold, in the wet, out for a walk in the driving rain, or kind of walk through mud, or I don't know, being on a hike where it's all gone horribly wrong and the mist has come in or whatever, and you feel wretched and cold and wet, and all you're longing for is a cup of tea or a cup of soup or a decent bed or whatever, and then magnify that times 100. Yeah. And you're getting somewhere, aren't you? And
well, yes. I mean, the thing that he talks about, and he talks about it a lot and at length in that book, is the difference between you and the dead man is nothing. There's the dead man next to you. It could so easily be you, but it isn't. And all the conversations you're having are with people who could be dead any second, who could die any moment, or you could die any moment. And what's the difference? How can you live in that state of sort of permanent, the idea that there is no future, that you cannot bet on anything at all. and White talks about that.
Because you got this line, haven't you? I glanced around at all the rugged, friendly faces and felt reassured. We were all in the same boat, but it was difficult not to wonder a bit, to think of the families of each at home. Where would each be in a couple of days, a week hence?
Yeah.
It could be 5 minutes hence.
I mean, and that's it, because that chapter centers around this ambush they find themselves in.
Yeah, and of course, those 32 sappers they get.
Yeah, well, there's 32 sappers are blown up, but when they're patrol, they're being asked to flush a wood out.
Oh yeah.
And they go into this wood, and first of all, there's some German civilians who live in a cottage in the wood, who basically all kind of like give them a guilty look and then bugger off, like, because they must know where the Germans are or something. You know, they're tangled up in the drama. But they've been told there's no artillery support, there's no tanks, but they've got to do it anyway. So in they go. It goes horribly wrong. He has to leave 2 men behind. One of whom a guy called Biles, one of whom he put on a charge the day before. So it's this heartbreak of and he regrets putting him on a charge. And Biles has had enough. Biles is sick of going forward. Yeah. It has done enough start lines for a lifetime. And you could argue one start line is enough for an entire lifetime, but they've been doing it over and over and over and over again. And the next day...
and that's the point, Bud. But the point is they've been doing it over and over and over and over again, despite being incredibly late into the war, effectively.
Oh, yeah. Oh, they're just chucked completely in the deep end. But the thing is... And then the next day, there are artillery and tanks. And they do have support. So the whole thing...
But Biles gets wounded, doesn't he?
But Biles dies. But
he dies?
Dies overnight. But this thing that... None of it need to have happened if the tanks and artillery had been available. They needn't have done it. So these lives are spent on, very often the lives are lost because of delay or because of, someone's needed somewhere else, and you're not the people who can call in what you need and all this sort of thing. And he's contending with being the last person in all those decision chains. And basically, his company commander says, "Well, it's your turn today, Peter. Sorry, we haven't got any tanks, haven't got any artillery. Anyway, that because the tanks can be a pain in the arse. The tanks can get tangled up and shoot at the wrong people and all that. So let's not worry about it. Good luck, And what's also interesting is, in the chapter before that, I talk about 6th Airborne Division and their sort of baked in kind of mission command or whatever you want to call it, right? So they aren't calling it that, but basically that O group. That by this point in the war, the O group that Peter White goes to is, okay, Peter, there's a wood here. We need you to clear it out. You know what to do. Crack on. There's no that's the extent of the orders, and that's experienced people, who've been essentially they've trained and then they've learned on the job as well. That's your Auftrag tactique, or whatever your mission command or whatever you want to call it. It isn't the idea of the prescriptive. You will take this hill, you will advance no further. It's that wood needs clearing out, chaps. On you go, you know what to do. And this sort of shaken down thing that happens to the British Army, 3 or 4 times during the war, where it has to learn its trade again and learn its trade for the different environments. Each new environment it finds itself in, it has to sort of relearn and readapt. And he's the product of the 6 years of the army getting serious, the army getting the right kit, the army getting the right ideas, and then the army figuring out how to keep people motivated. right at the end of the bloody thing, And he's really, really, he has to figure out how to motivate himself as well. Of course,
because that's the biggest challenge of all.
Of course,
because everything in your brain is going, hide under that tree, behind that rock, and don't put your facing the firing.
And what's the point of any of this? And
not much is a joke of it by that stage.
Yeah. I mean, he's really, really interesting though, because he writes. I mean, the thing is, as you said, he's from South Africa, Surrey via South Africa. He wants to be an artist, and he's 14 or something when the war starts. So maybe it'll be over by the time it's his turn, and then it isn't. And he's religious. He's a pacifist. And yet he finds himself as a platoon commander, doing as we've said, the worst job of the lot, the hardest.
And
job
you're
of the lot.
19.
I know.
That's the thing. That's so absurd.
But it's
interesting. I still
though,
think of my son Ned as being kind of ludicrously young, and he's now 21.
Yeah.
And I remember going to the Reichswald Cemetery and seeing that, Lieutenant Reese, whatever his name was, survived one day in battle with the Sherwood Rangers before being killed, and he was 19.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
Jeepers, it just.
But that's a double-edged thing anyway, because you need young people because basically, 35-year-olds can't do this because it's too exhausting. Even the fittest, 30-year-olds find this basically too exhausting. So first of all, there's that. Secondly, they might have a family, so they might have a completely different view of the world. They might have kids, so they might think that and also by the time you're that much older, you don't think you're indestructible anymore. So who else are you going to get to do it? You need young people who ought to be being irresponsible.
I remember looking at the Malta Brigade's attack on Regal Bhutto, and I was talking I was with the British Army, and I was talking to some colonel, and he said the one thing you can be absolutely certain of, as long as there's 18-year-olds, there will be wars.
Yeah.
He's right. But my point is as a 19-year-old, that's one thing. If you've joined up, you've gone to Sandhurst or you've gone to West Point or wherever, you've done that because you want to serve, you want to be in the army, you want to do your bit. But the point about someone like Peter White is he's a pacifist, doesn't want to be there at all.
Yeah.
And you're there, and it's thrust upon you, and at 19, you are still very, very callow. Even if you're, very mature for your age, you know shit all, don't you? I mean, you know nothing about life.
Yeah.
And suddenly you are being expected to make life and death decisions in a split second, as Peter White mentioned.
I mean, what's so interesting? What's really interesting with him though is he does communicate the full extent of his responsibilities as a subaltern. So he tells you, he really does. You kind of learn everything he has to do, and his big bugbear is when they move into new positions and the condition that the positions that the previous occupants have kept them in, and whether they've had discipline about noise and whether they've had discipline about moving about and all that sort of stuff. Because he's very, very hot on that. Because of course, if you keep the noise down and if you move about in a concealed way, the enemy won't clock where you are. The enemy won't figure out where you are, and you won't be easier to attack. And that's right. That as one of his duties, arriving in a position and going, right, okay, well the previous lot, his guards are in before us. They've been very, very noisy here, so we're probably going to need to dig somewhere else. We're probably going to need to figure out a way to make these positions work for us where they haven't already attracted attention to themselves. And he's doing all that. He's obviously reading their mail. He's making sure they're fed. He's making sure they're obviously weapons clean first. He's doing all that stuff, making sure they're getting enough sleep, making sure that patrolling happens. And one of the things he ends up doing is he takes on all the patrolling in with the jocks. So it makes it clear that he basically tries to take on all the patrolling responsibility so his men can sleep. And his descriptions of patrolling, when he's had an hour's sleep himself and he comes back and he can't remember quite where his lines are, and he can't really remember
Jesus, where. Can you imagine?
And you hope that in the end the sentry has got the wit about him to realise you're not a German crashing around in the dark, and you're a.
But again, it's sort of. It's quite dangerous just crashing about in the dark. Now, I mean, if I was to sort of go out in the middle of the night and start wandering around the woods or whatever, the chance of me falling over and kind of stabbing myself or walking into sticking out bit of branch or any number of things or getting tangled onto barbed wire is quite high, I would say.
Yeah.
And then you're doing that with lots of people kind of, pointing guns at you and
looking to kill you.
And Myers looking to kill you. I mean, it's just sort of, you sort of scarcely can comprehend it, can you? And it's sort of also reading that Peter White chapter kind of reminded me again of that sort of last months of the war, going through Germany, the Sherwood Rangers having to go on. Someone had to be on point.
Yep.
Someone had to lead the regiment through the wood.
Yeah.
And it's C Squadron's turn this time, and it's number 4 troops' turn, and if whoever's up front, you are going to get attacked. It's just literally as certain as kind of night follows day. I mean, imagine the tension. You imagine how kind of uptight, and you know that kind of the end of the war is just around the corner.
Yeah. Well, that's the I mean, that's what's interesting about the Peter White stories. He comes in for the end of the war, and there's no sense that it's the end of the war when you're fighting an SS cadet camp who are all desperate to kill or be killed. You know, it's horrendous. Anyway, let's take a quick break. We'll be back in a second so that Jim can carry on bigging up my book. Welcome back to We Have Ways of Making You Talk with me, Al Murray, and James Holland, of course. We're talking about this is the trade paperback. I went in today to sign sort of 500 copies for the publisher, and then
no pictures of cricket matches or anything.
No picture. No, that's on Wednesday when I go to Cole's Books, and I have the ones for the IC.
A similar number for the IC member.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I funnily enough, I went. I was killing time in Leeds on Saturday.
Well, hold on a minute. I was just going to tell me that. Hold that thought for a minute.
Yeah, go on.
Because before you do that, you promised that I was going to pick up your book, and I
go on then. Yeah, carry on. Yeah,
I would like to for a minute. Then we'll go back to Leeds in a minute. Because I think it's really interesting because I've been spending an awful lot of time in the last couple of months thinking about what is it that makes a good book. You know, what is it? I think complacency is the danger of anybody and anything, but I think particularly so with writing history. You know, what is it you're trying to do with a history book? And I know what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to entertain people. I'm trying to inform people in a way that urges people to kind of turn the page and read on and get through to the end, but whilst having the kind of the requisite amount of authority so that the person who's reading it feels they can trust me and trust my knowledge and my authority on this particular subject. And it's I've touched on it before, but it's such a hard thing to do. And so with my Italy book, what I'm trying to do at the moment is trying to think, what's the fourth wall? Is there a fourth wall in which you can sort of knock it down? Do you just have to tell the story chronologically? Yeah. You know, this is what happened. These are the main players. This is my analysis and a bit of kind of description. And I think there is something more that one can do. And I think what you've done, just absolutely straight up, is written a book which feels completely fresh and different to anything else that's come before. And I mean that in a very, very good way, because you want to... Each chapter is self-contained, but part of a bigger thesis. So that all completely works. They're all really entertaining and they're entertaining reads. The writing style is incredibly good. It makes you want to read on, but it's also full of new information and new perspectives. And I think it's that combination of a lightness of touch with the writing, but really moving parts as well, particularly, you know, something like the Peter White chapter. But you want to be challenged to think of things in a different way. And that's what it's doing. And trust me, I've read so many books about the Second World War. And I would say the vast majority of them are really boring.
Well,
I don't put kind of sort of memoirs in that category, although there's quite a few boring memoirs as well. But the vast majority of general histories on the Second World War are not good. They're poor. They just are. They're not interestingly written. They've either weighted too far in one direction or the other. They're either so kind of fluffy with the writing that you don't trust the authority, or they're so authoritative and academic and boring that they're just dull as dishwater. And I think you've nailed it. I really, really do think you've nailed it. I think you're saying something really interesting. It feels authoritative. You're saying something new. You're saying fresh perspectives, and it's all done in a really entertaining, compelling form.
Well,
so,
thanks, Jim.
Bravo.
That's very, very, very kind of you. Funnily enough, I was on Thursday last week. I went to the Grafton Arms, Jimmy Grafton's pub, the where the Goon Show was born.
Oh, fantastic!
For a meeting with some of the London independent companies. So,
nice.
Ant Bomber Brental organised it all, and they gave me a framed photograph of my grandfather James, and the officers in his battalion in 1939.
Oh,
so
yeah, I know that
really
picture.
lovely thing.
Yeah, look, what
really
a
lovely
thing
thing to give me that he'd got from the rifles depot, and a
nice.
copy as well, for a copy for my mother as well, which was really lovely because it was her birthday on Friday. So, but we got talking. What are you going to write next? And I'm thinking, well, that's very sweet of you guys because you've not read this one yet, so you may not ask me that again. Yeah. But and inevitably, you're going to write a book about Market Garden, and you know what, or about Arnhem, and the way, of course, we descended into Arnhem chat. It's the nature of the beast, right?
Yeah.
But the thing is, the reason that isn't the first. You might expect that'd be a book I'd write. The massive problem with that is how on earth do you write a new book about that? How on earth do you approach that and write? Because all the accounts are completely baked in. Even the way, it's really interesting. Even the way you tell the story of the second half of the week, after the bridge has fallen, they're in the perimeter. Those days, any account you read, the Thursday, the Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, the Wednesday gets a fair bit of stuff. Then the Thursday and the Friday of that week and the Saturday, basically just kind of, it's a series of incidents that you always get told about in any account you read, and those chapters get shorter and shorter because it's essentially repetitive. And there's no other way of writing about it. There's no new way to pop into it. Because I remember ages ago we talked about this before, and I said, I'm thinking of just doing one day. You do the Tuesday where everything goes to shit, where the bridges in they're under massive pressure. They can't get into the town. The stuff in the woods goes horribly wrong. And you just do the one day. Because there's just no point trying to write a fresh book about what happens in Arnhem. It's because it has been absolutely done. The subject of this book is for me the question, because if allied preponderance of stuff and operational art is the thing that wins the war, it still doesn't answer the question of how they won,
or why it took that time, or why it took that time, or the form that it took.
Yeah, why they were going wrong where they were going wrong, and all that.
Because I'm very convinced by the kind of, the two strategic earthquakes, but otherwise it was all to a large extent preordained. I think broadly speaking it was, but I do think there are a number of, obviously there's a huge number of variables.
Yeah, and the thing is,
and how it played out is down to individual commanders, as you're pointing out in this book. And very convincingly too, and also and odd moments and odd decisions and particular aspects of those specific commanders. So your chapter on Monty isn't about Monty and his overriding arrogance in the Battle of the Bulge or something. It's you're taking a completely different take on that, and I think that's really. Well,
I'm not
really
interested. I'm not interested in that because you could. Do we have to tell that story again? Right. Who cares? No. If you want that, you can go and get it. It's literally everywhere. And also, I think, again, it's the thing we talked about on Thursday. We got into, But the interesting thing about Montgomery isn't whether he was a pain in the arse or not. I'm not interested in that at all. And you look at the system he's trying to operate.
The interesting is his approach and how he approaches command. And
and the system he's operating, and the system he's operating within hasn't yet figured that out. And an awful lot what the book's about is the penny dropping. You've got to professionalize, and you've got to, because I think
you've got to work with the parameters you've been given.
Yeah. And also, if you've got someone who's really good but is a pain in the arse, like Patton, and Patton arguably should not have come back after the slapping instance. He should not have come back. You can argue that's he's gone too far, especially with the Citizen Army, that he's blown it. But he's fired and rehired in pretty quick order because they know they need someone that good. That they can't squander someone with that kind of talent. And I think that's really, really interesting because it actually tells you what the American priority is. It's winning the war, and what they've got to do is manage their citizen soldiers rather than kind of be led by them. And I think that's really, really interesting, especially because American public opinion has been so volatile about the question of of even entering a war. And then when they do recruit an army when there is no war on, it causes them all sorts of problems politically. Like they'd almost run away with themselves. Questions of morale and questions of extending the draft and all that sort of stuff. And extending people's service, which is the really controversial one. When people have been in for their 18 months or their year or whatever, and then the war starts, and they're like, "Oh, sorry, you're still in the army." And the problems that causes in a country that's never had a standing army.
Yeah,
it's all, or not a major one. It's all really, really, all that's really, really interesting, and it's about the penny drops for the Americans. Patton might be a complete pain in the ass. He might have done the worst thing he possibly can, actually, which is to slap a soldier who's got combat fatigue. Who cares? Who cares? We need men like that, actually.
Yeah, because this is
we've got to get this done.
This is our war. We've got to get it done.
Yeah. But I think what's interesting though, because I think that some of this isn't some of this isn't inevitable. I think if the British had got their heads on their ideas squared away sooner, you wouldn't have needed to fight the Second Battle of El Alamein at El Alamein. You might have been able to fight it somewhere far further west. If Tobruk hadn't fallen and your supply lines were all located that much further west because the Gazala Line battle hadn't been such a calamity, and that's because the British haven't got their head straight yet, and they haven't figured out what it is they need to do and the people they need to prioritise and the methods they need to prioritise to make the war winnable. And that's that's what the start of 1942. As we say, the Janus Facier looking back to defeat and forwards to victory. And there's that. Yeah,
but at every step of the way, they're finding new circumstances for the first time. So overall, they're kind of their understanding is improving.
Yeah.
But you go from the contrast of the North African desert to an island such as Sicily, such as mountains in winter and raging torrents and blown bridges in southern Italy, to Normandy, to Arnhem, to suddenly Peter White arriving in the Lowland Division.
Yeah,
and at every step of the way, there are principles that work. Battle schools and all the rest of it. The training under live firing. Of course, that all counts for a decent amount. But at every step, the Allies are facing new conditions, new scenarios, which they have to adjust to.
And of course, the pressure they impose on the enemy causes the enemy to change what it's doing.
Yes, because the enemy's not just standing still either.
Well, exactly, and escalate and accelerate, and also dig in peculiar ways, in ways that are unexpected. I mean, after all, the Normandy battle isn't expected to pan out the way it does at all.
No.
They don't expect the Germans to be so stupid as to stay under the naval guns. They don't think anyone's going to be that daft.
Because why would you? But the other thing I think you bring out really well is this whole stuff about 79th Armoured and Hobart and I suppose that brings you on to kind of this notion of how we tell the narrative of the Second World War, and there's been some very obvious trends, haven't there, about how you tell it, and we've talked about the bigger trends of kind of sort of belittling the Western Allied effort, and big the expense of the skill, the tactical skill of the Germans, and all this kind of stuff, and the impressive losses of the or terrible losses rather of the Eastern Front.
Yeah,
but actually there's a sort of narrative which emerges at a kind of much smaller level. And one of them is that you talk about Funnies on D-Day, but then you never mention them ever again.
Yeah.
And I thought that's fascinating. And I think it's fascinating that, the part that 79th Armoured plays and becoming such an integral part of the way the British Army moves forward and Canadian Army moves forward.
Yeah. But they vanish. They vanish into the story. But absolutely, every attack in Veritable that you might read about, 4 flails go forward. Well, that's okay. That's 79th Armoured then, and a crocodile comes out. 79th Armoured. That's who that is.
Yeah. And I think one of the reasons is people don't understand that 79th Armoured Division is not operating as a division.
Yeah.
It's training as a division, and then its component parts and then being spread to the 4 winds once you get onto the continent, and it's needed elsewhere. And I think that's really fascinating because that's unique. And so that's the other reason I suspect it's not really talked about, because people don't really understand how that works.
And yet, what are the lessons that are baked into that? That you train people who are flexible enough to fit in with anyone. You know, there's when crocodiles go in and help the Americans out, they're promised some crocodiles. The Americans call that debt in, and they're blown away by the fact that these lads from 79th Armoured, they turn up with their crocodiles. They're used to working with different people.
They're used to slotting in.
They're used to just slotting in. They know how to slot in. They know and they're also very good at making clear what they're going to do and explaining how what they do works, which I think's obviously the other is the flip of any, it's a reciprocal relationship, and they're really, really good at that. And what's it is Hobart has been, in the 30s, he's an inflexible sort of self-contained tank formation guy. And he ends up with a tank formation that is the opposite of self-contained. It's completely devolved. It's completely at everyone's disposal. And in a strange way, he kind of achieves the thing he says that he wants to do in 1940 when he's called up by Churchill. Churchill says, "Oh, we need a tank army with this many tanks." And in a strange way, Hobart realizes that by going at it completely differently, which is like, my armour is at the army's disposal rather than an armoured army with some infantry in.
Yeah.
And what's really interesting about it is the things they figured out for 1919, for Plan 1919. Armoured personnel carriers, tanks properly devolved and integrated into with infantry formations and all that, just gets forgotten about. And by the time 45 comes round, when 79th Armoured are invisible because they're literally in every battle. They're literally in every single battle in Northwest Europe. There's people from it. And whether it's Buffaloes or whatever, they're doing it all. And of course, it's no coincidence that he's a sapper by origin, because it's got that RE kind of thing about it.
Your stamp on it, hasn't it?
Well, you're present at everything, and you're solving the problems that the infantry need solving and all that sort of stuff. Really, really interesting, that simple aspect of it. But he ends up, and what's brilliant about Hobart is he changes his thinking, because he really is one of the tanks on their own people from the late 30s. Just get me some tanks or tanks with some anti-aircraft guns and maybe some bust infantry, but it's a tank formation, like the idea of a Panzer division, whatever. But he ends up right at the other end of the scale, but he changes his thinking, and that in the end is the thing that's the end. In the end, the British Army has to change its thinking over and over and over and over and over again, and wins. Having changed its thinking, without sounding like an idiot. And you could look at the German army doesn't change its thinking very much, or seems not to.
Well, it goes from moving forward to kind of defence, doesn't it? But the same principles, always counterattack, be always be aggressive.
Yeah.
Expect too much of your men. I mean, those are all absolute constants, aren't they?
Yeah.
I mean, I think even if they had the luxury of manpower and they weren't stretched, I still think they'd expect too much of them. I don't give them regular leave and all those kind of things.
Yeah. But what's also in the mix, of course, with Hobart is that questions of his personal life absolutely dominate his career.
Yes.
In a way that I don't know. Would they now? I don't know. It's very peculiar, and he's got all these people basically writing him off because he's a correspondent in a divorce. Wavel's wife writes him off for that reason, which I think is really, 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 really interesting.
That's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah, and he's the guy doing the thinking and the training and all the work on armored formations. He really is, and he's doing it. And he basically creates 7th Armored Division. Creates the Desert Rats out of the Desert Farce and all that. He does that. But they still don't like him because of his marital situation.
And he never wrote anything down, did he? I mean, are his papers somewhere?
There are papers and letters and stuff. Yeah, there are. Yeah.
I know Bovington's got. The Tank Museum have got some down in their archives.
He's a vigorous correspondent.
Right.
And told his wife everything as well. And of course, there's there's the whole business that Monty had married Hobart's sister, so he's got that. But he's got that peculiar relationship with Montgomery, where he goes, I go to see I was privileged enough to go see the the mighty Monty today, the Generalissimo has finally granted me an audience and all this sort of thing, because he finds him funny. but knows him, so he's able to joke like that. I mean, it's a very really interesting insight, because he's obviously seen Montgomery's star rise when his own was actually, when his had been snuffed out.
Yeah.
You know, and there's the whole thing where he's relying on Churchill's patronage, which isn't enough at the start of the war. Actually, it's not quite enough. You need Brooke. Once Brooke's on side, you're okay. But he's such. I just think the funnies become the norm. They stop being funny. They become the norm of how you do things. And yet, you know, they're a sort of D-Day. Did you know about D-Day? Sort of interesting, quirky thing about D-Day is these funny tanks that were invented, but then they carry on using them forever.
Wow,
because
absolutely.
They're so useful and they're so good at what they do.
Yeah, amazing.
And what's really interesting is when he starts retraining the division, he's got all these sort of hussars and people going, yeah, but we're here to do swanning. We're a breakout formation. He goes, no, you're not anymore. Sorry, you've got minefields to clear, and their crews are all really angry about it. The officers are quite angry about it. Think they're being deglamorized and that sort of thing.
But what a role! I mean, what a job!
Yeah.
I mean, in terms of sort of importance and value.
Yeah.
And force multiplying.
shows. Yeah, and this whole thing that he, in the end, you know, you give that job to him because you know what a brilliant trainer is. You know he's going to apply himself, and he's able to put that beyond his previous theorising, which I think is really interesting.
I can't remember what happened to him after the war. He didn't live that long, did he?
No, he didn't. No, so he did a bit more sort of tank R&D after the war, a couple of years of that. Then he left. He tried to become a historian, interestingly, and then he died of cancer. I mean, sort of 5-6 years after the war, I think.
Wow.
Yeah,
it's very sad, isn't it?
And not relegated from the record, but sort of turned into this kind of like quirky chap with the pike staff.
Yes, it's sort of good old-fashioned British eccentricity, isn't it?
Yeah. But in fact,
which is sort of admiring, but also kind of a bit demeaning in a way, because he's so much more important than that.
And also, you know, makes it sound like. I always think that the problem with the idea of putting it down to eccentricity is it makes it sound like. If you're a hard-nosed professional, some eccentric's going to beat you to the punch. So what's the point of being a hard-nosed professional? Whereas in fact, he was a hard-nosed professional.
Yeah,
he
absolutely was, wasn't he?
Absolute bastard of a man, you know.
Yeah, and I think that comes across really, really well. Yeah. Well, it's a brilliant book, Al. You know, my hat goes off to you. I think it's a really, really, it's a proper history book. It really is. Right. And
thank you.
Deserves to do really, really well.
High praise indeed. Thank you very much.
Well, for what it's worth.
That's probably not. Well, no. What was I going to say? So I was in Leeds.
Oh yeah, in Leeds. Tell about Leeds.
I was at the Armouries in Leeds, and I got to the very end of a small arms, display of, from before the Brown Bess up to the SA-80 sort of thing. So, and I asked the guy, what's the wood on the short magazine Lee Enfield, and he didn't know. I said, well, where's it from? And he didn't know. He said, that's a good question.
Why is it?
Right. So while I was being a pain in the arse, there's another guy.
Go on, just
where is the wood from? What wood is it? It's a hardwood of some kind, but where are they getting it from? Because if it's an imperial product. Yeah. Anyway, this bloke gets talking, and we get chatting, and he goes, are you who I think you are, and all this sort of stuff. And he goes, my grandpa was a Chindit.
No. Oh, yeah. You mentioned this on the WhatsApp group.
I said, really? He goes, yeah, he's a Chindit. Yeah, he's a Chindit. And his grandpa had refused his medals because, basically, you had to send off.
I love that. It's so brilliant.
You had to send off for his medals. So he didn't send off for his medals because his view was, they're not going to send me my medals. I'm not going to ask for them.
Yeah, I just love that. It's just like old school cussedness, isn't it?
Yeah, but he was a sergeant when he was 17, this guy.
Wow.
His grandpa. But and then the guy goes, but I don't really know much about the Chindits, because I go, which expedition, which brigade? And he's like, He's like, I don't know, I haven't really looked into it. So then I pulled up a screen grab of Chindit by Richard Rhodes James.
Nice.
And said, you need to read this, mate.
Yeah.
This is what it's all about. But it's
how
interesting.
Fantastic. But did you find out about the wood?
No, I need to go away and figure that out.
I know who would know. Lieutenant Colonel retired John Stevenson.
I thought I thought it struck me as an interesting question because the steel's got to come from somewhere, the brass has got to come from somewhere else. Where's the wood from? And if you're making them in Canada, what are you using?
Is it mahogany? No, too heavy.
Well, it looks like it might be, but it's got to be a hardwood of some kind. Because it's got to take the vibration.
I just never even. It just is.
Yeah, exactly.
So much
anyway,
that's
all we've got time for. Maybe someone out there knows and can say it's.
Well, one thing we should say is this is going to go out on Tuesday and on the 4th of October, which means that
Tuesday evening,
this evening, you and I are
Guildford at the book festival talking about the book.
I'm just prodding you gently, aren't I? In questions about.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. I might read a little bit.
New
Stop it. I can't handle it. Anyway, thanks for listening, everybody. We'll see you all again very soon. Cheerio.
Cheerio.